Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Townsend Center, to the book chat series. We're pleased to host Martin J., the Ehrman Professor of European History, Emeritus, for a discussion of his recent book, Imminent Critiques, the Frankfurt School Under Pressure. He's joined by Karen Feldman, professor, and are you still chair of German? Okay, and chair of the Department of German. I wanted to mention a couple of events that are happening in coming weeks. Later this month, on Tuesday, February 27th, we'll be hosting a conversation between Doreen Saint-Felix and Hilton Alls, both of whom are staff writers at The New Yorker. Hilton Alls is also a teaching professor here at Berkeley in the English department. Our Avenali lecturer for this year is the poet and novelist Ocean Vuong, and he'll be visiting us on Thursday, April 4th and Friday, April 5th. The Thursday event will be a conversation between Ocean Vuong and Kathy Park Hong, and then on Friday he will give a reading. And then I just wanted to announce our book chat for next week. Our next book chat will be between Darcy Grimaldo Grigsby and Carl Brito, and they will discuss Professor Grigsby's latest book, Creole: Portraits of France's Foreign Relations During the Long 19th Century. And like I said, that will be on Wednesday, February 21st. So we're looking forward to your conversation, Marty and Karen. So I'm going to turn things over to you now. Thanks.
Thanks. I'll start. It is a terrific honor to be invited to talk with Marty today about his new book, Imminent Critiques, the Frankfurt School Under Pressure. Given the broad expertise on this campus on Frankfurt School thought and history, and Marty's own towering presence at Berkeley over decades, there are plenty of people here who would have a lot to say about each and every essay in this collection. So my goal is to give just a selective summary of the book for about 10 minutes, and then I can set up a few questions to begin with. But before that, I want to make known that this book has already won a prize for its index. The Purple Pen Contest for New Indexers described the obstacles faced by novice Elizabeth Bartmus. The contest called Marty's book a very difficult book, targeted at scholars already familiar with this school. And the contest highlighted the fact that, quote, there was no guidance from the author on how to approach the indexing. The judges, as the announcement goes on, the judges found that Elizabeth had met this challenge by setting up a, quote, network of cross-references linking the various discussions of the main themes, end of quote, which is, of course, what an index is. But it's also what a book talk is. So now I will do like Elizabeth Bartmus and set up a network of entries and cross-references to link the various discussions of the book's main themes. A, apokatastasis. See also Benjamin, Walter, and Agamben, Giorgio. Your essay responds to Frederick Jameson's 2020 The Benjamin Files, laying out, this is the essay on Benjamin here, the first one, lays out in mercifully exegetical detail Jameson's trajectory of thought on Benjamin over 5 decades. You suggest that Jameson reassesses Benjamin not as a left melancholic, but as what you call a left manic, overtly refusing mourning, keeping wounds open while holding on to an exorbitant messianic hope. As you revisit Benjamin's references to redemption and messianism, the relatively obscure concept of apokatastasis makes an appearance. Apokatastasis referring to the ultimate resurrection of all bodies and perhaps all bygone things. Now, apokatastasis has been controversial in its original Christian context. Why should the bad guys be resurrected and redeemed along with the rest of us? Why should hell be emptied when plenty of the people who end up there deserve it? And would an apokatastatic finale empty all of the suffering in the history of the world of its unique tragedies? You hint that Jameson's argument for a Benjaminian left manic apokatastatic hope doesn't hold up in the face of the overwhelming Benjaminian melancholia, and perhaps it does not even justify or satisfy Benjamin's own condemnations of barbarism. B, biopolitics. Your essay on the Leib-Körper distinction lays out the uses of differentiating between the body as experienced and the body as an object in the world. The essay proposes that neither Leib nor Körper, neither the own lived body nor the body in the world, should be taken as a locus of transcendence. Rather, you argue, the non-totalized, unreconciled, non-transcendent existence of both might permit a thinking of biopower, biopolitics, and necropolitics. Against Foucault and Agamben, you extract from Benjamin's references, see above, to apokatastasis, a more optimistic view of a non-sacrificial, non-idealizing existence of vulnerable individual human bodies. This is all quite abstract, but true to the essay's 2021 provenance, you concretize its normative impetus, exhorting Agamben to get yourself vaccinated, damn it. C, contemporary politics. C also P, the pathologization of politics. You write about the problems of defining political positions in terms of pathologies, specifically with reference to the authoritarian personality, but also with reference to our present problem of how to talk about, much less talk to, people whose political views we find abhorrent or even deplorable. There are, as you explain, a host of complications introduced by the figures of pathology and diagnosis when talking about political views or mass movements. Do we want to attribute an individual's repugnant political views to a lack of maturity or a deficient development or a psychological abnormality? Do we want to say that a society, a state, or a political party is pathological? And where do we get the norms and normative authority for these claims? Here you evoke the Eurocentrism of Frankfurt School thought, since the treatment of an irrational social pathology imputes universal norms to human society in general, and all of this points to larger questions of the source of normative approaches to social and political existences across the globe. R, Racket theory, requiring less abstract theoretical armature, you write about our age as an age or another age of rackets, in which moral principles, laws, and impersonal markets are supplanted by exchanges of loyalty for protection. But while Trump is our past and possibly future racketeer in chief, you point out it's not just Trump, it's also Big Pharma, FIFA, and college admissions. And it's global with Russian kleptocracy, Brazil's crony capitalism, and so on. Your essay indicates that racket theory is nothing new. Horkheimer, for instance, proposed that the rule of formal law and market forces only held for a period of classical liberal capitalism that has now ended. And the racket, with its exchange of loyalty for protection, constitutes a return to a more direct form of governance. T, truthfulness. Your book's most hopeful essay, as I read it, is on lying and hypocrisy in politics, which you've written about already, but you revisit it here. Building on Arendt and opposed to Marx and Badiou, you argue that truth is coercive, and especially you insist that truthfulness is overrated. Truthfulness is the wrong value to assign to democratic politics. Hypocrisy and lying are necessary for democratic politics because alliances are built on partially shared interests that must for a time be amplified. So politics depends on the need for, quote, a fiction of greater common interest and values than is the case, end quote. The demand for truthfulness doesn't accomplish any kind of purification of politics anyway. It serves mainly as a weapon against one's opponents. You're not on the side of any big lie, but rather you say, I quote, it may be healthier to foster lots of little countervailing lies, or at least half-truths, as well as the ability to test and see through them. You hold open, therefore, a space for a non-idealized agonistic disputation in contrast to a charade of truthfulness. S, sublimation, out of order here. You return to Adorno in your essay on what you call posterior cultural sublimation, the repurposing of cultural objects as art. Freudian sublimation involved what could be called a sacrificial logic. The primordial drives are sacrificed for the higher spiritual, cultural, or intellectual accomplishments. And the individual artist, for instance, is credited with an individual sublimation, resulting in a particular work. Adorno, as we know, insists instead on the autonomy of the artwork, not of the artist, and cross-referencing again apokatastasis, art would also then be the reservoir of past suffering that is not transfigured nor redeemed nor emptied of its uniqueness. But you draw out of Adorno another more Hegelian notion of sublimation, posterior sublimation. When the Louvre is repurposed from being a palace or secular sanctuary holding sacred artifacts, from being a palace holding sacred artifacts to being a house of art as the people's patrimony, that's a posterior cultural sublimation. Church objects losing their sacred status, becoming art objects in museums. For Adorno's purposes, these are examples of cultural sublimation that do not have the pitfalls of Freud's individualized, subjectivized, misery-sacrificing sublimation. Back to T for tropes, see also Jewishness and anti-Semitism. You write in an unflinching essay about how Adorno and Horkheimer, Arendt, and Erikson examine Jewish responsibility for anti-Semitism. This is a charged formulation, but in each case, you're referring to the non-arbitrariness of anti-Semitism, to its place in a historical constellation where carefully untangled historical reasons for anti-Semitism are not to be mistaken for blaming the victim. You explain how Erikson suggests that Jews dispersed in drastically different contexts maintained flexible relationships to their worldly vicissitudes and were seen, therefore, as relativizing absolute values. Marx, Einstein, and Freud, here paradigmatic. And at the same time, they maintain their identity, which engenders hostility and envy. Adorno and Horkheimer, somewhat consonant with Freud's claims in Moses and monotheism, they connected Jews to the domination of nature, describing Jews' sublimation of ritual pagan sacrifice into symbolic ritual as supposedly establishing a template for the sacrifice of workers' labor. The contradictions multiply from here. Jews initiated the dominant of nature, but they are also, as capitalists in this narrative, a remnant of the Edenic condition before that process. They contributed to the miserable modern world, but also resist the world they created. And in each case, for Adorno and Horkheimer, Jews embody utopian alternatives to everyday life and toil, which again evokes hostility and envy. Arendt makes a different argument, claiming that since the loss of Jewish sovereignty during the Roman period, Jews gave up on politics and worldliness, and in modernity, they foolishly believed in the safeguards of liberal universal human rights and citizenship. And yet, as a pariah people, the Jews turned away from the care of the world, from the amor mundi, and suggests that a Jewish belief in being chosen and different and separate lent itself to the evocation of anti-Semitism. As you point out, however, most of these explanations of partial Jewish responsibility for anti-Semitism rest on tropes rather than on evidence, and for that matter, on contradictory tropes. For instance, the trope of Jews' paramount love of material wealth in the world, and the trope of Jews' paramount love of tribe. As David Nierenberg, Alain Finkielkraut, and Sarah Hammerschlag have shown, the repercussions of figural Jews on the lives of actual Jews reveals the worldly traffic between literal and figural. Finally, Z, Zionism, the most surprising essay in the book, because it is less well-traversed material in your work, is for me its first one, in which you write about the absence of any apparent relationship between the Frankfurt School and anti- or decolonial thought. Here you turn to the thought and experience of Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse with respect to Israel. You start with the 1971 meeting of Marcuse and Moshe Dayan in order to argue that understanding the Frankfurt School's positioning in Germany in the late 1960s and early 70s, and its fraught relationship with the German New Left requires looking at the Frankfurt School not in terms of 1968, with the social turbulence and heroic echoes and revolutionary fervor, but in terms of 1967 and the Six-Day War. Some commentators, you name Enzo Traverso and Amy Allen, suggest that the Frankfurt School's political deficit and pessimism during the late 60s and early 70s could have learned from redemptive political voices that emerged in poor countries, especially in the global South. You argue that for the Frankfurt School thinkers, the Six-Day War evoked the possibility of another destruction of the Jewish people. The conflict was therefore not experienced as an episode in the anti-imperialist struggle for global justice. So this brings me to my first question, and I have three, but we don't have to do all of them, or I can add more. So the book, as I've just described, makes powerful claims about the Frankfurt School regarding Jews, Jewishness, and Zionism. This is all, of course, incredibly charged right now, but your argument about 1967 and 1968 has resonances with today's fraught conflicts over Zionism and Israel-Palestine, and you write about the fraught question of, as I've said, Jewish responsibility, and also on Arendt on the Jewish homeland versus a Jewish state. So does the work that went into this book affect your view of October 7th and the war in Gaza? And how do you read your own essays now?
Well, first of all, let me thank Stephen for inviting me and Karen for that absolutely terrific summary of many of the points of the book. It's very hard to do this kind of exercise for a book of essays, which don't really fit together. I mean, each essay pulls a particular string in my encounter with critical theory and the ways in which it might be applied to the world. One of the strings was generated by an invitation in, I guess, 2018 to go to Frankfurt and talk about the 50th anniversary of 1968. And I chose in that essay to talk about 67 as part of what I called an expanded field of studies of critical theory, in which one didn't have a simple linear analysis with a meta-narrative, but rather an analysis that, following Walter Benjamin, put together lots of different moments, the debris, we might say, past moments in new constellations. So the expanded field included 1967 and their response to what they perceived as a threat to the existence of Israel. In 1967, you know, the war, of course, came out the way it came out, but when it began, people were not clear that indeed Israel would survive. And their perspective was basically the perspective of 1945. That is to say, as survivors of the Holocaust, they were very clear, and you can see this in their private correspondence, that they had no interest in the Palestinian cause, because there wasn't so much a Palestinian cause in 1967 as an Arab cause. They identified Nasser in '56 with fascism. So they were looking, from our perspective, perhaps backwards rather than forward. Now, here we are in, you know, so in 2023, 24, with October 7th hovering above us. And this is a question the book obviously doesn't address. But what it makes us, I think, aware of is how this constellation of different moments rearranges our attitude towards various positions that we might have held at earlier times. And this is not, you know, I'm not going to get on the soapbox and talk about October 7th or the aftermath, but it shows that they were at least holding on to a narrative, which was the narrative of the haven for Jewish survivors and potential Jewish victims that Israel represented. Now, you can take that as a myth, you can take it as an enduring reality, but that was their perspective, which basically they never relinquished. Ironically, as Jack Jacobs points out in his book on the Jews in the Frankfurt School, it was Erich Fromm, who had long since left the circles of the Institute, who was most outspoken in his hostility to Jewish nationalism. The others were far more nuanced. Fromm was the one who fairly early on said no, binational, you know, without any sort of ethno-national identity. So these are issues that we're all struggling with. I have no, you know, I have the same, I would say, turmoil that we all share about this, but I don't want to, you know, spend time talking about that rather than other essays in the book. And I'd like to really, you know, thank Karen for doing a terrific job of pulling out some of the themes which we can, I think, discuss as well as that particular theme.
So let me ask you a more general question. Reading the book and, reading it in light of your other books, what is it like to work on the same thinkers, roughly the same ideas, texts over decades? The Frankfurt School, lying. You even come up with new things to say about Benjamin. So how do you decide, what's a new project? Where do you decide you have nothing more to say, if ever? What is the experience of coming back and back again to these authors?
Well, that's a great question, which, sort of at the end of the career that I've had, you really begin to think about. I mean, I first started this work in 1967 when I began my dissertation. The dissertation came out 4 years later, my first book in 73, and then, had a significant impact and a lot of translations, whatever. So that was a moment in which I had the privilege, really, of being perhaps the first person to put it all together and make it available. But of course, at that time, I was still a kid. I mean, I wrote, 1967, I didn't know anything. I mean, I was 23 when I began this. So to learn what I was, what I had to learn to write that first book was a very steep curve. And I realized very quickly, as people began to write new books with enormous amount of nuance and new materials and with different perspectives, how little I understood, how much I needed to really work on this. So in the subsequent years, I've written a number of them. I've certainly departed different projects on, French attitudes towards visuality or the experience, or Marxism totality, which went beyond the Frank. I've certainly gone many new different directions, but there's always been a kind of awareness that there's a lot more to say. And the great privilege that I have is not merely being the first to write about their history, but to be writing about people who are worth writing about. In other words, they were themselves enormously fecund as intellectuals. And I was able to get access to many things in 1967, 71 that were available then, but there's so much more that's become available. So I'm able now to read more of their work than was available in those years, and respond to other people's, reworking of it. And as a result, over the years, I've been asked to write about things. So I very rarely generate essays. It's usually, would you write for this conference? And so this book, and there's another one called Splinters in Your Eye with the same cover, which Verso published just 2 or 3 years before this, which also collected essays. So the past few years I've generated, I don't know how many, 25 essays, whatever it's been, which, tease out different themes. And although I still, try to move away, the fact that they can be used, and I don't want to say that I'm simply repeating what they can be used as stimulus to think about other issues, has proved valuable. Not without criticism. That is, that's why Imminent Critiques is a book which expresses also my distance from them, but as a toolbox to think with. Critical theory in its various permutations, because remember, Habermas, Axel Honneth, Rainer Forst, Sheila Ben Habib, there are a lot of really smart people who continue the tradition and who continue to challenge its normative, foundations, to apply it in new areas. We mentioned Amy Allen and others who use it to think about post-colonial and other stuff. We can move it beyond its blind spots to think about it in ways that then enrich it with gender theory and so forth. So I think it's a theory that has been enormously enabling as a way to not simply repeat or to remain stuck with the original material, but rather to move creatively behind it, beyond it, rather.
So I want to also ask you about liberalism and leftism in the Frankfurt School and in your own thought. For instance, the essay on lying in politics defends the role of hypocrisy and lying because they're necessary where political alliances are forged discursively. And this seems to represent a straight up liberal rather than a left position. Your essays on the on pathologization and Leibkörper, worry about organic metaphors in possibly a similar way because of the false and potentially oppressive unities they might promote, including what might be seen as left unities. So I'm wondering, how much do you see, or do you see against the grain, a liberal strand in the Frankfurt School? And what does this mean, in your view, for leftism and its relationship to liberalism which I mean, you can say more about how that comes out.
Well, this is a hard question to answer because we'd have to spend a lot of time defining liberal, defining leftism, defining how they fit together and don't fit together. I mean, the Frankfurt School basically began as radical, even utopian thinkers who were dissatisfied with what we might call conventional leftism, that is to say, certainly communism in its Leninist and then Stalinist forms, and tried to think, as other figures in the early Weimar era, like Ernst Bloch, tried to think outside every possible envelope. In other words, to really push things to a point where all the pieties of the left and certainly liberalism were challenged. And I think that's been salutary, although, of course, it's possible, you mentioned apocatastasis, however you pronounce it, that is a kind of utopian idea that doesn't resonate with me. Now, it turned out in the American exile, Horkheimer and Adorno, less perhaps than Marcuse, Horkheimer, Adorno, Lowenthal, others, Neumann, recognized that there was something in the liberal democratic tradition that they had underestimated, that they came to the United States as a haven and began to see, well, it was a little more complicated than they had thought, and it was necessary to maintain certain democratic norms, which involved perhaps pluralism, involved questioning some of the absolute utopian hopes they brought with them. And when they went back to Germany, Horkheimer, Adorno, Pollock went back, they were involved in a kind of project that was left liberal, that tried to recognize that post-Nazi Germany needed to be democratized, needed to be infused with belief in human rights, even though one could challenge them. I mean, I wrote a piece, I think it's included here, on Horkheimer's preface that he wrote to the exhibition of Edward Steichen's The Family of Man, which came to Frankfurt in the, I think, late 50s. Now, this is often attacked as a almost quintessential liberal exercise in good feeling about plurality and one that doesn't really take class or other things like that seriously. Horkheimer liked it. He liked it because it gave basically a liberal message, which in the 1950s in Germany still needed to be heard. And then, of course, the second generation, Horkheimer in particular, rather Habermas in particular, had integrated what I would call certain liberal democratic ideas into critical theory, deliberative democracy, post-metaphysical notions of rationality, certainly not instrumental, but communicative, which involved the possibility of listening to other people rather than assuming one had a singular truth. So that what we might call the liberal moment in critical theory was then amplified. Now, there are other people who push back against that and say that's a mistake, it's a loss of the critical energies of the first generation. What I would say in response is that one of the lessons of critical theory is what I called in the first book a dialectical imagination. So one has to approach liberalism as well as leftist theories dialectically. There are aspects of them that one wants to criticize, but also aspects, residues, traditions, potentials, impulses that need to be, in a way, refunctioned, rescued, perhaps read against the grain, but still have value. So that, you know, human rights, we can talk about that ad nauseum as a kind of universalist imposition of Western ideals, and we could say it attacks the particular cultures, but without human rights, we just simply got rid of them, an awful lot would be lost. So the liberal tradition, which argues for that, needs to be heard, even though also criticized. And I think critical theory is interesting, partly because it understands even its opponents dialectically, rather than just dismissing them. It doesn't have an either or, it has more of a both and idea. And this means that even the liberal, and one might even add the conservative tradition, broadly speaking, has moments in it that need to be heard, need to be taken seriously, need to be learned from, rather than just dismissed in a kind of ideological war of us versus them. And that's, in a way, the impetus behind that essay where I disapproved the idea of pathologizing our enemies, saying that they're nuts and we're saying that, you know, we're healthy, they're pathological. Makes me very nervous because I always think that they have, in their grievances, in their sense of having something lost, they're calling out to us to listen to something that's worth hearing. And so it requires a more sensitive dialectical approach rather than one that simply makes a radical difference between us and them.
Thanks. So maybe for my last question, I think it's time to, I want to ask more about the immanence and the imminent critiques. I mean, it may be what you just referred to,
Right.
you know, the dialectical quality here, but you, in the intro, I mean, you seem to be describing a method, you know, or at least hinting at, I just want to hear more about how that's, I mean, it's not your method. I mean, it's drawn from the Frankfurt School, but obviously with sort of the Martingale, you know, historical apparatus and everything else. How would you describe the immanence and the pressure that are named in this?
Well, the big challenge in a way is to come up with some sort of point d'appui, some sort of place from which critique can be launched, some place where you have a lever which says, well, this is wrong because I have some sort of value, some sort of you know, authority. Now, there are lots of sources of that authority: nature, natural law, the paternal authority of, let's say, tradition, the authority of reason, however we understand it, the authority of revelation, lots of authority that can be used as the source of critique. And we need all of those in a way. I mean, I'm not going to say just out of, you know, hand that each one lacks a kind of foundation, because it depends on which context they're used. Now, what the Frankfurt School recognized was that searching for an absolutely eternal, transcendent source of critique can get you into trouble, because every source of critique is rooted. It comes out of a particular source. I mean, in between these two books, I published another collection of essays called Genesis and Validity, in which the validity of ideas is always, to a certain extent, tied to their genesis, tied to who says it first. And we all know, of course, that, you know, speaking as a becomes a kind of source of authority in certain contexts. So the question of transcending critique, assuming that you have a God's eye view, a view from nowhere, a view that gives you the right to speak for the transcendent, is hard to maintain. And therefore, one has to say, where does critique come from? And one answer is the idea that within a culture, within a series of values that exist in any particular time, contested as they might be, there are ways in which we can leverage what people say they're doing against what they actually do. So there are many examples of that. We call ourselves the free world. Well, you know, in some ways we are, but in many ways we're not. And so the idea of a more perfect union, because the United States is not yet really a union, the idea that we aspire to something that we haven't yet achieved, gives us at least some leverage to say that we are not necessarily hypocritical, but not yet adequate to what the concept suggests. And this is true of many different contexts, so that every context has within it tensions. It's never, I mean, we often think of cultures as fully coherent, as fully settled. But in fact, every culture, I would argue, and this is maybe a transcendent argument, has within it tensions, contradictions, if you want to use that term, which allow us to think of it as filled with possibilities, potentialities, what might be, rather than what necessarily is. And even, of course, those potentials that exist in the past. So immanent critique also involves a remembrance of possibilities lost, potentials that were, you know, once seemingly there to be realized, but which have been somehow squandered or lost or forgotten. So immanent critique goes back even to what we once thought was possible, to see what may be possible in the future. So that's one version of it. Now, they also recognized that immanent critique was itself in danger in what Marcuse called the one-dimensional society, or Adorno, a fully administered society, in which the gap between what is and what ought to be had narrowed. Adorno in Minima Moralia says there's not even a crack, a kind of a crevice where you can hold your hand in the current society and see what could be. We're also somehow caught in the Verblendungszusammenhang, the kind of, you know, let's say, I don't know what, constellation of mystification that we can't see beyond it. And therefore, in a way, immanent critique is inadequate. We need to come back to transcendent critique, to norms which somehow hover above. So my basic endpoint in this is there's a negative dialectic, to use Adorno's phrase, of the two, that we can't rely on either transcendent or immanent critique alone. Each one is inadequate, each one has potentials, and one has to somehow use what we can to make possible critique, because what is the case is clearly in some ways inadequate enough that we feel we must move beyond it.
Thanks. So now we have about 15 minutes for questions or discussion with the audience.
Gun silence.
Well, let me ask you then. You said you've taken some distance over the years from
Right.
some of the views, some of the thinkers. I'm curious about particular points of distance. I mean,
Right.
some of them are in this book, but I want to hear an amplification. Like, what are the distances that you find yourself taking after?
Right. Well,
coming
one of the very first essays I published in 1969 in Dissent was an essay called The Metapolitics of Utopianism, which was a critique of Marcuse at that time, a critique of the idea that politics needed to be basically a kind of consensus or an ingathering of one, different positions, one position, which led to utopianism. And there I in a way anticipating my interest in Habermas, said no, pluralism meant that, you have inevitably dissent, inevitably opposition, that politics will be agonistic rather than fully and completely based on a single notion. So in later books like Reason After Its Eclipse, which tried to make sense of the Frankfurt School's long struggle to come up with an objective notion of reason against which one can critique instrumental reason, I argued that they failed, that objective reason basically as a metaphysical idea, as an idea that came out of German idealism, couldn't be defended, that they had an intuitive sense, a noetic rather than dianoetic sense of what it was, but they didn't really have one that I think stood up. And Habermas tried at least, and he recognized that this was not working, to come up with a different notion of communicative interaction as a basis of a kind of rationality which involved better arguments, involved persuasion, involved giving justifications, rather than believing there's a single notion of reason which one could hold on to the way, say, a philosopher king might. And Rainer Forst has also developed this in his work, in which justification is the key issue. How you justify, how you persuade, rather than seduce or manipulate, is crucial to democracy. That I have to assume that you can be persuaded. And I also have to assume, and this is the crucial premise, that I can be persuaded, that I can listen, that I can understand something better after having heard your position. Now, this may be obviously utopian in its own right, but the point being that you give up a certain kind of arrogance of superiority of knowledge, which occasionally the Frankfurt School fell back into. So I've always felt a little nervous about that. People have argued they should be understood as Marxist in a kind of orthodox way. It seemed to me what made them interesting is that they certainly created a lot of ideas taken out of Marx, but moved beyond it and were not dogmatic in walling it off against other ideas, beginning with psychoanalysis and many others over the years, which create a more eclectic, open-ended, experimental version of Marxist, post-Marxist thought, which I would hold on to. So, there are those moments where I felt, well, these criticisms are well taken. The Racket Society thing is fascinating. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one that I do find interesting, which they themselves abandoned. And in that essay, I talk about the Scorsese film, The Irishman, which gives us a sense of how the Racket mentality permeated, trade unions, politics, and other aspects of modern life in a way that was not the case in an earlier film On the Waterfront. I counterpost to that, where there are versions of an alternative. In The Irishman, it's pretty close. The Racket Society is everywhere. And racketeering as a model, the idea, as you said, of loyalty and domination, loyalty and protection, rather than a playing field which involved rule of law and involved perhaps the arbitrariness of the marketplace as a kind of impersonal institution. That model is now, alas, more prevalent than it was when they developed it in the 1930s and 40s. And I, was in a way, delighted is not the right word, but I felt confirmed when when Trump was accused of the RICO Act in Georgia of racketeering. That there is a quality of racketeering in the way in which his version of how one should be, you know, a political figure and authority, and how he treats people through the loyalty protection model that is very explicitly expressed in their ideas. So there's one that I found underestimated.
Also, in the international context, you point out South Korea, NATO getting.
If you look for Rackets, I mean, certainly, you know, the kleptocracy in Russia, there are lots of places where there is this model of a strong figure who protects. Other people have to be loyal, and the rule of law doesn't apply to them. You know, Bolsonaro's Brazil was another example. One can think of many others around the world, and also in institutions. I mean, even I mentioned the Catholic Church and the way it handled pedophilia. I mean, this is a protection racket, you know, where people got away with stuff because they were loyal to the people at top who protected them against being prosecuted. And, you know, there are cracks, people recognize that as a way to undermine it, but it's a model that has, alas, too much, I think, applicability today.
Philip,
Cool.
go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Oh, here comes the mic.
Thank you. I want to follow up on the Racket theory discussion, because in Frankfurt School, I mean, there are basically two concept political theories. The Racket theory is one as a reformulation of class theory in a way, a universalization of class theory. And the other one is the administered world, which is in a way a classless society. So the paradox of a classless class society. And my question for like about today would be if administered world and Racket society can coexist with each other.
Well, I think coexistence is always possible because you have a, you know, basically fractured and, you know, I would say contradiction might be the wrong word, but inconsistent world in which even the state capitalism model, which you've written about with Pollock, you know, there's a certain truth to that as well. The state has the ability to, you know, basically intervene, what we call the deep state or whatever, you know, in ways that undermine democracy, undermine the ways in which people make, you know, a decision from the bottom up, as well as the marketplace. I mean, it functions. There may be good ways to intervene in the marketplace, maybe not. So there are lots of, I would say, balls in the air. And so to call the Racket society, to leave it at that would be a big mistake. That there are elements in it that work in that way. Administration, state capitalism, the idea that we're controlled, well, you know, we're aware of that as well. Surveillance techniques now have grown. There's an ability for algorithms to control us in manipulative ways that we hadn't, you know, in any way anticipated before, whether or not the state or through corporations or whatever that. So it's extremely difficult, and that's why all of these theories are helpful but not adequate, to think in a kind of complicated and eclectic way, rather than to seek for the simple, essential answer. And so Racket Society helps us to understand something that we perhaps had underestimated before when we thought we had a real rule of law, and we thought we had a level playing field, more or less. And also the issue of class. I mean, class obviously comes back. You know, class means something, and we recognize that sometimes, you know, in connection with gender and race and other issues that involve inequality. But certainly we don't live in a classless society. I mean, there's no question that we're still struggling with that issue, but there are many other ways in which injustice is served, and certainly Racket relations, I think, have to be understood as important today among them.
Yes, over there.
Thank you. And I just want to say my appreciation to you, Martin J. I guess I'm curious in your estimation, if you can talk about or identify what might be contemporary legacies of critical theory in the Frankfurt School, even for those who don't explicitly name the tradition of thought. Because I was thinking about even the way you characterized the dialectical imagination, imminent critique, and things like these are very winning ways of being in the world and seemingly rare. But there are folks, and I would love to hear.
Well, you know, it's a great question because the tradition is so diffuse now that one has to avoid saying it's a, you know, monolithic system or it's a formula with, you know, some sort of, you know, coherence that we can then apply. What it has, and I always like the idea of a kind of debris field. You know, Benjamin often talked about destroying something to create a field of debris, which you then reconstellate. And the Frankfurt School itself, now 100 years or 101 years since the founding of the Institute, I think represents also a kind of field of debris that, you know, we can take a little bit from here, the Racket Society business, take a little bit from there and forget the rest. That it's available, and it's available to be reconstellated with other critical theories. So, you know, they never really developed much of a theory involving, say, gender or LGBTQ issues. They were, you know, people of their moment. Now, this is not to say they didn't address it, Marcuse in particular, but we now have more of a sensitivity to those issues than they did. The post-colonial moment was not their moment. And so, you know, there are people, we mentioned Enzo Traverso and others who said they should have had this one emblematic moment when Adorno had a lunch with C.L.R. James that got nowhere. And so this is, you know, sort of the moment where they missed that opportunity. But we can fill it in if we need to, or we can think in the way that that essay tries to argue that post-colonial theory needs also to have a little, let's say, reflectivity about its own inadequacies because of some of the things that they might have said in different contexts. So I think those, broadly speaking, would be, you know, part of the legacies. Now, what's fascinating, and the end of Splinters in Your Eye has a discussion of this, is that the Frankfurt School has itself become demonized as a meme in culture wars, as the source of cultural Marxism by the radical right. And from, you know, Breivik, the Norwegian mass murderer, up to figures today, Carvalho, who was a, you know, inspiration for Bolsonaro and others. I just got an essay to read on Sue Ellen Braverman, you know, the British minister, whatever she is, who uses cultural Marxist theory. So this stuff has entered the bloodstream of the radical right, and the Frankfurt School has become a kind of negative image of everything wrong with modern society, including things they never wrote about. It's kind of an amazing story of the way in which the Frankfurt School has become something that never could have anticipated, which is a popular culture, negative meme, which refuses to die, which was essentially started by Lyndon LaRouche in the 1990s. And then, you know, in this other essay, I talk about how it spread and how it continues to spread. It's still, I mean, it's amazing. Jordan Peterson, you can listen to, you know, Michael Savage, you know, I don't know what, Ben Shapiro, all these people repeat this garbage. So the Frankfurt School has had this, I would say, salutary, you know, critical impact among people like us, but also has had this netherworld afterlife in this other world of conspiracy theories and craziness, which, you know, is something that we all now recognize is here to stay, that we're stuck with this stuff. That the internet and, you know, the craziness out there is not something that's going to go away even if Trump is defeated. So, you know, there's that aspect of it as well. I mean, the relation between critical theory and critical race theory, for example, which the radical right sees as absolutely essential. Cultural Marxism, Frankfurt's critical race, is of course nonsense. I mean, blacks didn't have to be told by the Frankfurt School that there was systematic racism. It's absolute nonsense. So, you know, this kind of odd genealogy, pseudo-genealogy is also out there and needs to be confronted, perhaps with the tools of critical theory itself.
Wonderful.
Yes. Oh, in front of you.
Here. Going back to the very beginning, could you talk a little bit more about redemption and messianism and perhaps the difference between them and how they relate to other themes that you explore in the book?
Well, this is a really stimulating question. I recently completed an essay on Adorno and the point of view of redemption, because as you, I'm sure, remember, after at the very end of Minimum Rally, he says, you know, today critique needs to be launched. We talked about imminent transition from the point of view of redemption. So I asked him that, I said, what the hell does he mean by redemption? I mean, this is a religious concept. Is Adorno really, is it symbolic? Is it metaphor? What does he mean by redemption? It's a term that Benjamin used in various contexts, as he used messianism. Now, one has to really do homework to make sense of what these terms mean. And whether they're in a Christian or Jewish or other religious traditions, they have a lot of, I would say, baggage. They mean something to different people in different ways. And basically, they introduced it in ways that I think were symbolic, metaphoric, but not obviously literal. I mean, there's no real sense that messianic intervention in the world through a Messiah or redemption, the sense of this apokatastasis as the overcoming of all types of evil will one day at some end point, some day of judgment, all these will be forgiven. It's hard to know what to make of that. So I struggle with that, what we might call theological fellow traveling in the Frankfurt School, or what Agatha Bialik-Robson calls crypto-theologies. And in her work, I don't know if you know her work, I've gotten very interested in it recently. Agatha Bialik-Robson has a wonderful book on Derrida, which also brings to bear this issue, has shown the ways in which various religious, theological traditions have had their afterlife in contemporary philosophy. I'm just finishing a piece on Gianni Fatimo and his use of the idea of kenosis, which I also find very troubling. So this is a great question, and I can't give you a short answer because it really requires making sense of those terms rather than just simply using them as if we knew what the hell they meant.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Could you explain why you find kenosis troubling?
Oh, boy. Well, do you really want me to go into it? I mean, there are lots of reasons. I mean, kenosis is the self-emptying of God, which in certain creation stories is the explanation of the creation of the other, which is the world, the universe, the non-divine. It's a term which goes against an immanentist notion of creation as produced by God somehow exfoliating himself. There's the idea of contraction and God's created. Now, someone like Gianni Vattimo uses it in particular with the incarnation as the emblem of a kind of self-emptying of God into a human. What he does in particular, which I find deeply troubling, is to separate it from the crucifixion and the resurrection, which involve notions of sacrifice and redemption, which he wants to avoid. Now, one could go into whether or not this is a correct understanding of kenosis, which, by the way, is a religious, according to traditional Christianity, a religious heresy. It's one that was actually denied largely because Jesus understood not as a self-emptied God, but as equivalent in his divinity with God, at least by Orthodox Christianity. Now, my other issue with kenosis is that, especially with the incarnation used by someone like Vattimo, it creates a sense of the Hebrew version of God, the God of the Hebrew Bible, as a God who had not yet self-emptied and had not yet created a closeness with the human, which is what Vattimo in particular sees as ultimately the source, and this is really paradoxical, of secularization. Now, there are problems with this version of kenosis because there is, in the Jewish tradition, with the idea of tzimtzum, which the Lurianic Kabbalah developed in the early modern period, which does have a notion of self-emptying in a way and has sometimes been compared with kenosis. But I mentioned Agatha Bialik-Robson, who argues, no, it's not, because it doesn't have a notion of sacrifice, doesn't have a notion of redemption, has a notion of a kind of healthy, we might say, exfoliation of otherness and alterity without a redemptive, let's call it, return of the aroma or fullness of God. Now, this is getting into theology far, deeper than I normally, feel comfortable getting into. But the question was asked, and it's a great question. And I'm happy to talk more about it if you want afterwards.
Maybe that's a preview of the next book that we can look forward to in a couple weeks or so, Marty, at the usual pace. Let me thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the Townsend Center and to the audience.
Thank you very much.